everybody. Thanks for joining us. And this is Hello from Singapore. My name is Ling. So thank you everybody for coming here today. And actually, some of you probably have seen me from the morning of Singapore time till now. So it's 8 p.m. So it's very, very dark. And I imagine some of you might be having breakfast or lunch. So it's really great to be in the company of this international community. And so for the Singapore Lake, actually, we started right about 8 hours ago. And we had a noontime Singapore time, we actually had a workshop, facilitation workshop. But this panel is actually the first public broadcast that we have. And we're very excited to be, in the same connecting line with Rotterdam as well as the rest of the world. We really hope that you will participate enthusiastically. Some of you might be on Facebook, hello, and some of you are on YouTube, and some of you are on Vimeo. So there are these different platforms where you can type in your chats, comments, and questions. So please feel free to type in all these things. And otherwise, can you help us also, those who are on Facebook and YouTube, to like and share so that more people can come and watch this session today and the rest of the sessions actually as it comes on. Now, one last thing before I hand over to the moderator for today is that some of you might want to find out more about the context of what we are talking about in Southeast Asia or in Malaysia and Singapore. Actually, if you go to the ICAF website, there is a accompanying reader in this particular session. So you can take a look at that while you listen to us share about our kind of work. So the accompanying reader was prepared by the three panelists in terms of sharing with you more about the context of the kind of environment that we work in. And lastly, I would like to introduce you to the moderator of tonight. So may we bring on Sunitha? And Sunitha is a dear friend and a lecturer in arts management. And her research interest is in social practice. And so I'm very, very excited to have her here today to help me moderate this session. So over to you, Sunitha.
Thank you very much, Ling. And thank you also to ICAF. It's very nice to be here to help introduce international audiences to some of the community-engaged arts practice in our corner of the world here in Southeast Asia. I am Sunitha, the moderator of this panel, which we've called Social Practice, Communities and Culture, Perspectives from Singapore and Malaysia. Because you're all part of this international conference on community-engaged arts practice, as we all know, increasingly we see more and more artists around the world using arts and culture to tackle challenges in their society. And across Southeast Asia, we definitely do find artists working with communities in a range of ways. Some do so in partnerships with NGOs or with government agencies, while others are working independently or as part of civil society groups. Some adopt a more interventionist approach, while others may be embedded in their communities. For many, their work is centered on principles of inclusivity, empathy, and collaboration. Our panel consists of speakers from Singapore and Malaysia. And before I introduce them, I want to say a few words to set a bit of context about these two countries. Both Singapore and Malaysia have a multicultural citizenry with significant ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity. Since the 1980s, both have experienced rapid urbanization and economic growth. Singapore, as you all probably do know, is a tiny city-state, but it's now ranked as one of the top 5 richest countries in the world. And it also ranks as one of the most livable cities in the world and also one of the most expensive cities to live in. It is also notably a country with an aging population, excellent life expectancy, but low birth rates. Malaysia was considered one of the Asian tigers until the financial crisis of the 1990s and has never quite regained this status. The country's development has been affected in the last several years by high levels of corruption, and it's also been rocked by an international financial scandal and political upheavals. Both Singapore and Malaysia have a shared colonial and post-World War II history, and both are recognized as semi-democratic nations, or they're also described as examples of soft authoritarianism. Southeast Asia as a region is unfortunately known for authoritarianism, and also it's known for having relatively weak civil society. And this is certainly a fact in Singapore and Malaysia, with both countries having a number of laws in place to curb civil liberties and high instances of censorship and severe limitations on freedom of expression. The work of artists and cultural workers, hence, is very much impacted by the socioeconomic and political contexts. For some, their work is precisely in response to these realities and challenges. So having said that, we will now hear from each of our speakers who will make 15-minute presentations, and then we'll follow that with time for questions and for us to consider their work in context, as well as to take questions from all of you. I'm going to introduce them now. Our first speaker is joining us from Kuala Lumpur, Janet Pillai, who is an artist and activist, as well as a researcher and educator. She's a specialist in community-engaged arts practice and will be presenting an overview of this in Malaysia. We will then hear from Grace Lee-Khoo, who is a theatre director, performer, dramaturg, researcher, educator, and producer. In 2018, she founded Access Path Productions, which is a disability-led creative organization, and she will be talking about their efforts operating intersectionally between cultural, social service, and policy-enforced spaces in Singapore. Our third speaker, whom you already know quite well, is Koh Hui Ling, who is the co-artistic director of the Singaporean theatre company Drama Box, and as you all know, she's also the curator of this first ICAF hub, Singapore, which is part of the mini ICAF with the Rotterdam team. Hui Ling will be looking at the last 10 years of community-engaged arts practice in Singapore, touching on issues of urban isolation, heritage, community, and the nation. We will have time for questions at the end, so please, wherever you're tuning in from, make use of the question chat mechanism to enter your questions. As the speakers are talking, you can put them in, but we'll take all the questions at the end after we've heard from each of the speakers. Okay, so I'm looking forward to an interesting next hour and a half. I would now like to invite Janet to kick things off with her presentation.
Thank you, Sunitha. Right, I'll dive straight into this. I'm going to talk about community-based arts in practice in Malaysia, and I'm going to do a kind of a wide sweep of some of the initiatives. So it gives you an idea of the variety of community-based arts. So just take a look at these photographs out here. I'll talk about them later, but they generally depict actual festivals or rituals that are quite common in Malaysia, even within the cities. And I'll come back to these, the significance of how community engaged arts actually leverages also on tradition in Malaysia. Next slide, please. So here we have a map of Malaysia. So we have a West Malaysia, which is on your left, and an East Malaysia, which is part of the island of Borneo. And the red dots kind of indicate the location of community engaged arts groups or individuals or initiatives. And most of them are actually centered very much around either the main capital city or two-tier, second-tier or third-tier cities on both East and West Malaysia. So in West Malaysia, you can see the majority, maybe about 60 to 100, community engaged arts groups or individuals, and less in East Malaysia. And the ones with the blue circles actually denote chapters of the same group, but they are an exceptional group called Buku Jalanan, and they actually diversified themselves across both East and West Malaysia. A lot of these initiatives take place in community setting, like community halls or public commons, etc. Next slide, please. Right, so the orientation of the practice is quite varied. There are some initiatives are in health and wellness or are focused on community well-being, education, social justice, livelihood, arts and culture and heritage, and also environment. And there are two kind of trajectories. One is more people-focused, which is more towards community building, developing awareness or problem solving within the community. And the other is more place-based focus, which is looking more at improving the physical environment or safeguarding heritage or safeguarding natural environments, etc. Next slide. So here's one case example of socially engaged initiative. This is Rakan Mantin, It's led by a visual artist, and the purpose of this initiative was actually to safeguard a village, an urban village, from destruction by developers, as you can see in the photo. And the initiative actually has got two focus. One is to build a community and create some kind of solidarity among the community, and the other is advocacy, using visual arts to actually put out this issue to the bigger public, particularly in the cities, who would then come to this area and rally around this community. And they also set up a kind of a folk museum of their history, and they have a lot of workshops that kind of promote their history and their cultural life. Next slide. And here's another example. This one is more of an environmental project, and it took place in a wet market with the vendors, with the fish vendors in the market. And it used also a very multi-arts platform. And the purpose was to actually move the fish vendors towards more sustainable kind of waste management, because they had a lot of waste material from their livelihood practice. And so the artists used various forms of art to either communicate to the larger group of vendors, like translating the issue into more vernacular drawings, so that they could have discussions. They designed ways of resolving the problem. They took photographs and used the photographs as a platform for discussion, and then created bins. And this was a very multi-stakeholder project involving the city council and the market management, organic farmers, as well as the vendors. Next slide. Go to another project. So this is a case example in East Malaysia, and this group is called Pangrok Sulap. They are about 15 people, very loose community collective of visual artists, musicians, social activists, and they use printmaking, which is very participatory. They go to different villages and they highlight issues affecting that particular community or the particular village. And the community participates in the process of woodcut printing, and then they have an exhibition. Their works are quite controversial. Yeah, so they are a kind of a roving group, actually. Next slide. And this is another example led by an artist, theater person, and academic. And it's she works in small towns, and her intention is actually to build intergenerational relationships within the town. And generally, her focus is to create sort of community spaces, either libraries or little public commons where the community can continue their work. She also brings people together through community festivals, and it's very inclusive of the all ages, all ethnicities that are functioning within that community. Also set up folk museums, which kind of are very participatory, where the stories or the photographs or the artifacts of the community are showcased. Yes, next slide. Just generally speaking, there are very clear characteristics among these variety of initiatives, community engaged initiatives. It's very values driven, either very humanistic or very environmental. Particularly with the second generation, we find more towards health, well-being, community building. With the first generation, it was more towards, I would say, maybe more towards social reform or political reform kind of trajectories. Also, they tend to have a lot of local endemism. That means they kind of use a lot of local performing forms, local tools, local languages, deal with uh, local cultural rituals, etc. The works are very, very site-specific and context-specific, mainly dealing with issues or problems that are related to that particular community. And the forms that I use, the form is very collaborative and very participatory, with the artist being more of a facilitator, intervener, but working on a co-creative kind of basis with the community. And sometimes multiple artists are working together. Next slide. So I think we can say that in a lot of these socially engaged arts or community engaged arts initiatives, there is a very strong attempt to rebuild the collective in these urban areas or suburban or smaller, secondary cities where the collective has really broken down, and communal structures have become very individualistic. It's got a lot to do also with the kind of economies that have taken over in these big cities, and to kind of, use culture as a part of the, kind of melting it with the art making process. So culture making and art making become the conduit or the process to bring people together and to rebuild a kind of a communal culture. So, and a lot of this is done in very public places, and a lot of, there's a lot of, artifacts or spaces that are left behind as continuity, so that there's a new commons, like either the folk museum or the community library, or the activities have some kind of sustainability with the community, so that there is some kind of ongoing public commons that the community then can continue to function within that common. Although not all of them are successful and sustainable, but that is the intention. Yes, so I wanted to relate it back to the first slide where you saw some photographs of traditional cultural and rituals, etc. So if I were to juxtapose, community arts to the, not juxtapose, but there's an attempt to use very domestic forms of art or very popular forms of art when working with the community. So sometimes concepts or ideas from traditional theatre or traditional arts is actually incorporated very indirectly. Although many of the artists are actually trained in contemporary or modern art forms, but they don't necessarily use the academic training or the very capitalist form of art. They kind of try to go against that grain by giving the agency over to the community and allowing more community to devise the narrative or devise the art making or culture making process, as opposed to this narrative or culture being controlled by a feudal power or a state power, or the agenda of the state, basically. So yeah, so let me stop there and pass you back to Sunitha, the moderator.
Thank you very much, Janet. We're going to move right along to our next speaker, Grace.
Hi, everybody. So my name is Grace and I am based in Singapore and I am the founder of Access Path Productions. So as Sunitha mentioned at the very beginning, it seems like I put on a lot of hats because we are a very small and lean social enterprise, and theater making is our main form of, or what I say, vehicle to really communicate our practice of platforming atypical artists and build up a community of what we call creative enablers that are, we're all growing together in the form of theater making, of performance making, and also inclusive practices that will enable atypical artists or disabled artists to do the best work that they can. So this is our logo. Some of you recognize that it's Braille. And also, sometimes it feels like in the context of Singapore, which is a young, scrappy, hungry nation that is, where everybody's kind of like constantly placed on the productivity train. And sometimes people might feel like, you have to be that cog in the machine in order to conform, to keep up, to contribute, right? And sometimes it does feel like our efforts are new. People are interested and they find it very refreshing. But on the other hand, it does feel like sometimes it's like a drop in the ocean of what we're doing, trying to communicate this new it's not new in other parts of the world, but in Singapore, I would say that, in recent time, this movement, this shift from what we know as arts and disability, which the arts and the relationship between arts making and the deaf and disabled community is seen as more therapeutic, more recreational. It's something to do in daycare centers and whatnot. And that's still happening around the world, as we know, to this shift towards professionalization and, of course, sharing these lived narratives of diversity and difference and advocacy, which is starting to become a little bit of a dirty word in Singapore. So but I think for us, we're taking on this role as like social engagement and how to bridge the gap between what the community, the deaf and disabled community of artists, how would they would like to bridge that gap with mainstream community. Next slide, please. Right. So, this idea of community is about gathering from the grounds up, creative people who are interested in taking risks in the sense of exploring ideas, identifying, solving problems, and expanding the scope of what is possible within the realm of disability arts. And so disability arts, like I've mentioned earlier, is different from arts and disability, where disability arts actually really comes from this seed of activism, this seed of struggle, particularly in the UK, where where we're talking about disability rights and the call for deaf and disabled people to participate equally and equitably in society, and so the engagement, the level of engagement of the deaf and disabled community, we want to expand the scope of what is possible within the artistic landscape in Singapore. And that's why Access Path was founded in 2018. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, we need to have a very, very strong foundation so that we can communicate to people who, to stakeholders, to gatekeepers about how we function. And I've mentioned at the beginning, we are a social enterprise, a creative organization. So we are not, even though we have been strongly encouraged to register as a charity, but there is a big rejection of what we call the charity model. And this is apparent in many countries where, the deaf and disabled community are given handouts. They are pitiable. They deserve to be, they don't deserve to be left behind, definitely. And it brings in this idea of what inclusivity means socially, within the context. In some places, it's about having a seat at the table. So we're seeing deaf and disabled leadership. We're seeing deaf and disabled advocates, representation, and being presented in positive and how would I say, taking charge in mainstream representation, right? And on the other hand, I would say that in Singapore right now, because the conversation is so new, it's not so much about having a seat at the table, but are we doing enough to make sure that we're allocating enough resources for the deaf and disabled community? So it's still a bit top down, if you know what I mean, right? So at Access Path, we're advocating for equity, for parity, for liberty, and this is communicated. The spirit of all this is communicated through the action of community building, the small but growing group of atypical artists and creative enablers who are part of creative process, who are volunteering, where we pool resources together to make the work that we believe in. And we are not bound by, because we don't have a charity status. We are a social enterprise. We are lean. We operate on commissions from different organizations such as the National Museum of Singapore, the National Gallery, festivals, not locally and also internationally. British Council is a valued partner. So that we have that space to be able to craft and create the projects that we want to do, which of course it means that you are producing a work with such a high degree of ownership and being disability led is important, but with the freedom comes with all the difficulties of gathering resources to make it happen, right? But because of this idea of you want that liberty and that parity and to equitably distribute resources to enable artists. Next slide. So underpinning our work here and what we're trying to introduce to people who are interested in our work here in Singapore, which includes having that conversation with stakeholders, with authorities, in a space where there is censorship, there is certain national agendas and ideas of what community building looks like in Singapore, right? So we play a part on top of making the work that we want to make, right? We have to introduce the social model here, which is a disabling world that it's holding people back when it comes to their path to opportunity to education and employment. And it's not just, in terms of art making. So the problem here is if you look at the slide, it's a disabling world and all the different barriers that deaf and disabled artists and also the community will face. And how can we take on this collective duty of care if we claim to be as inclusive as we want to be? Because again, that's the national narrative, right, of leaving no one behind. And it's about opening up that conversation and that encouragement to actually not just tick boxes, but walk the talk. Okay, next slide. So just to talk a little bit about the methodology of Access Path over here, these two images are what we always fall back on because we tailor our approach when we enter different communities across the spectrum of disability. And here, because I'm coming from the social model of disability, it doesn't just include those with physical, sensorial, or intellectual impairments. It could be marginalized communities who are again socially disabled and deprived of opportunity to, of access to social mobility and things like that, right? So we do use like what Boal say, art making is a rehearsal for real life. Theater making is a rehearsal for real life, and all these drama, which is our main medium of art making here, whether it's the utilization of the voice, the imagination, the story, the body, and working together as an ensemble. All these principles of theatre making are applicable for our participants and our artists to really explore what we call the aesthetics of difference and the aesthetics of diversity. So while often in our work, we present characters, figures who happen to have a disability, of course played by a disabled actor, but it might not be their story, but it's through that process of theatre making where they get to really explore lived experiences and also find the voices of advocacy. And the other image is the cultural iceberg, which is basically what we see as surface culture, your dress, your festivals, your language, things that are quite explicit, right? Versus what's difficult to see under the surface, which is most of it, if you think about it. I strongly encourage all of you to look into Edward T. Hall's cultural iceberg model, that if you haven't, about, how when you enter a community or you try to learn the internal culture of others, it's to actively participate in it. And an access path were about participation, because when you get past if there's a pyramid, if you get past the behavior, on the top, the beliefs in the middle of the pyramid, and then the bottom of it is really the values and thought patterns of a particular community, right? So from the most overt right down to what's underlying that dictates how behavior could be uncovered. So that is the kind of kind of guiding principle as we devise, as we excavate narratives that go against mainstream perception of what disability narratives are. Often they expect sob stories, or they expect inspirational, despite against all odds kind of story, and then they think that we're all working with Paralympians and whatnot, so triumph of human adversity, that sort of thing. So really, it's through theatre making, expand the depth of conversation that we're really having here interculturally, what it means to really bridge the gap between mainstream culture and its representations, which can often be quite damaging, with real lived experiences of disability and deaf culture. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly go through the kind of there's some case studies, the kind of the work that we have done, and see how the methodology that I've just explained, how is it put into practice. So this idea of vernacular theatre, it's colloquial, it's local features, it's locally made and sourced, and it's not top down. So very much, if you see the black and white picture on the top left corner, it's a collaboration that the link is in the reader of an online. It was a site-specific performance in the National Gallery of Singapore about the work of an artist, photographer Chua Subin. And you can see that we have a diverse cast. But the process behind it was highly participatory. So for me, right, I feel like at the end of the day, right, I like to use the word participation over inclusivity, diversity, blah, 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 because it's about active doing from different entry points. And inclusion is like getting an invite to the party, but participation is when you get to tear up the dance floor, the very, wheelchair-friendly dance floor. And so this process was stories about how people reacted to the space of the gallery and the work, because in Singapore, often a lot of cultural venues are very fixated on the numbers, how many people are coming to, they set a corner and then they click, 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 click. How many people are actually coming to see the shows? How many people are coming to interact with the exhibits? So I'm interested in not just the numbers, but what do people really think? And so a series of participatory, inclusive workshops of people streaming into the gallery. We got them to write the material, and all that material was then given to our artists who kind of put it all together. So it was in a way, it was letting the public, really truly members of the public, democratically and freely responding to artistic spaces and artistic work. And then those voices from the ground are being embodied by atypical bodies and voices. There's another picture on the right, which is the black and white picture. We have Stephanie, who's a wheelchair-using actress, and Sophie Stone from the UK. And Suddenly I Disappear It's on YouTube. It's an international collaboration, and our first project that was an international collaboration. It's a UK Unlimited Commission, and it was a big project that took about 2 years to materialize. And through that exchange of working with deaf and disabled artists from the UK, there was a lot of dialogue and discourse when it comes to what is best practice, and and then there's another picture of myself performing with my father that lives with dementia. So I was trying to explore this idea of, how dementia, people living with dementia would repeat themselves with such spontaneity and regularity, and how can that again be be embodied on stage about and it comes in a very organic way to hear his voice as someone who is dealing with living in the past and in the present at the same time, when your whole timeline of your life is being put apart and being reshuffled. Next slide, please. Yeah, so on top of the work that we do, we are constantly on the ground engaging with all sorts of stakeholders when we talk about whether it's daycare centers that we go teach at, whether it's venue programmers that program us, cultural venues that bring us into the space, and we use the space and we give feedback. It's very important that all that interaction that happens is underpinned by skill transference, is underpinned by disability role modeling. So we have Kevin over here on the right, who is one of our trainers, and he lives with Down syndrome, and he gets to do the best work that he can because of the social model that we practice, which is to give him the tools that he needs to succeed, the training that he needs. Next slide. And this is the last slide. So we do gun for cultural venue takeovers and that creation of allies who jump on board with, if they have to believe in the social model of identifying what barriers deaf and disabled artists or communities face. And then how do we work to, is it a hostile environment? Is it inadequate infrastructure? Is it attitudes that are of prejudice? And that needs to be seen through policy making. That must be seen through, it's not just platitudes. Oh, we need to take on this collective duty of care, but it's really seen through what are the auxiliary aids that are being provided, into real action. So we're at this very beginning, third year into our journey of constantly, trying to partner up with and create allies. And I'll just leave you all with this bit of, how there are stories other than medical narratives to share, and alternative creative means to tell these stories. So we're here always broaching various strategies to answer back to mainstream, this tyrannical mainstream narrative of what's normal. We want to counter that. We want to present rich embodied characters, that serves to, I would say, dispute all these binaries and dissonance in a post-dramatic artistic landscape that is community arts practice. So that's from me, and I'll pass it back to Sunitha.
Thanks very much, Grace. I just want to remind everyone that if you have questions, we will answer them once we've heard from all three speakers, but feel free to put them in the chat. And if you have a question specifically for one speaker, do indicate that when you write your question. So now we'll hear from our last speaker, Ling.
Hi, thanks, Sunitha. So I'm going to share about how it is like to practice arts or theatre, which is our discipline in Singapore. And I'll actually start by talking a quick introduction about Drama Box. So Drama Box is a theatre company, or rather we work mainly with theatre as our main discipline of practice, and we look at arts as a practice of change. And actually in Singapore is one of the few companies looking at social practice, and actually we constantly ask ourselves, what does that mean in an urbanized space like that in Singapore. Today, when I was preparing for it, then I realized that actually a lot more questions arose for me. And then I thought I might organize it around three main trajectories, which are all interconnected, but yet would still very much like to hear also your thoughts about responses to some of the questions that I might be asking. So next slide. Thank you. Okay, so Drawbox, we started actually in 1990, which is a very long time ago. And last year, we actually celebrated our 30th anniversary. But we started to, as a company, doing a lot more performances in theatre spaces. But actually, starting in about year 2000s, we decided that, if the people are not coming into theatre spaces to watch performances, maybe we need to bring it out to them and interact and be closer with them. And it also arose a few issues, because we realized that when we do performances outdoors in public spaces, we do suffer in a way from remnants of a few things, because in the 1960s in Singapore, there was this thing called Operation Cold Store, where there was a rounding up of communist sympathizers. And so that was one thing that was happening in the 60s, 1963. And then in the 80s, there was another rounding up of people who were involved in what they called the Marxist conspiracy here in Singapore. So with that 20 years of legacies at that period of time, you can imagine that a theatre company then starting in 1990s, wanting to do works in community or public spaces. When we started doing that, even in 2000s, we realized that when we do, in the early years, we do a lot of forum theatre performances, and then we realized that in terms of the public engagement at the start, it was actually pretty low in terms of when the anti-model ends, and we invite the audience to actually come on and have a sharing with us, or rather, to propose an alternative or a suggestion. The floor is silent for a long period of time, sometimes 15, 20 minutes, and then us, the jokers, will be, like asking, and then trying to facilitate that process. And it actually took a good 5-6 years before people started to be familiarized and gain confidence. Probably the social environment has changed as well. People were encouraged in education environments to actually also speak up and ask more questions. But we do feel that there was that legacy that was left behind from the silencing of a lot of voices in the earlier days, from the 60s to the 80s, all the way until actually we do see the impact in 2000. And actually, to do a performance in Singapore, that is something quite interesting that we have to do. I realize that it's quite different from many other cities in the world, is that we actually need to get a performance license. So to do any kind of performances, be it at public spaces, in theatre spaces, in bars, you actually have to apply for a public entertainment license and a police license. And only when you get a venue, the kind of shows that you're going to do, then they will decide whether they can give you that license or not. And with that, actually, in this photo that you're seeing, it says the Speaker's Corner. This is quite an interesting place. Actually, I'm live streaming from my office in Chinatown, central of Singapore. And this particular place that you see, Speaker's Corner, is a very iconic place in Singapore, just down the street from actually where we are, called the Hong Ling Park. So essentially, the place came about because there is this also other thing in Singapore, that public assembly has now equated to one singular person. If you do one person protest, actually it can surmount to Public Assembly Act. So similarly, to do sharing of protests or public speaking, you actually need to apply for a license to go and speak at the Speaker's Corner. So that is a designated area. As it is a nice park, as you can see. There is a gym behind it, and actually it's surrounded by tall buildings, which is the Central Business District of Singapore, as well as on the other side, it's actually the Subordinate Court. So it's in a very interesting area, a very green, serene space in all these high-rise buildings, but you actually need to get a license if you want to speak there. So that, I think, next slide, thank you. So in that sense, the voices became curated in terms of what you can say, what you should say, and what you ought to say. And with us here at Dropbox in the earlier days, we were working a lot with NGOs and targeted specifically at working with marginalized communities and getting and using theatre to bring their voices outdoors to communicate with other people who, or the majority, who might not have heard much about these stories or issues, or that social activism that we hope to bring about with it. And after working with NGOs for a few years, where the actors actually take on the stories, we realized that the voices, the people with the voices or the marginalized voices actually do need to speak for themselves. So then we started to expand into working in public spaces, as you can see in the photo. This is one of our more recent project where it is at this Dakota Crescent, which is a place I'll talk about later more, but essentially about bringing conversations that usually happen in what we call kopitiams, which are like coffee, cafe, local cafe places that you drink and then have a chat with your friend. And we decided to bring these invisible conversations onto public areas where these voices can then start to be heard, and over a longer period of time, meaning months and weeks of engagement with the community to talk about different issues. So we really hope that by working with on a geographical locale, meaning not just with a particular like NGO and their specific target community, we actually mark out geographical locations where maybe, for example, with the low income rental group, or there's a specific area where some maybe a more trying neighborhood, and then working with the stakeholders in the area to have these kinds of critical discourses and dialogues in public spaces. So we were imagining that by doing that, we reclaim spaces for voices to be heard and increase the visibility of these marginalized voices. Then next slide, please. And then when we started to work with people in the communities, actually and we get them to actually be the ones who share and tell their stories, one of the questions that is always asked to me is my story interesting? Would anybody care about my story? So if you can look at this photo, I'm sorry it's compressed, but if you look at these photos, the top two and the bottom right picture, these are actually people living in this community. And then they, through an engagement process of over 9 months of research at the start, we actually got them to become the performers during this performance, where they actually get to interact and tell the stories with the audience. And we also realized the importance of this oral history in terms of who then owns this thing called art. Because to them, it's my everyday life. My story is interesting. Who will care for my story? Is this then art? So that question of always comes up when we're working with communities. But during the process, the confidence in the individuals will increase, because we started to see, or rather allows them to see the imagination, or rather allow them to see the alternative, and they being able to imagine and relook at the everyday. That actually there is a reason for my being, a reason for my voices, and a reason for my stories. Just now, Sunitha at the start, she mentioned about how in Singapore and Malaysia we're similar in the sense that there is a lot of silencing of and deconstructing of communities. There is this word we use a lot in actually these two countries, which is the word kampong. Kampong essentially is a Malay word for village, but it is being used in Singapore as a way to say, there's a kampong spirit, which is the community spirit. And in the last few years, there was this very big movement about bringing back this community spirit, because the people, the general consensus about how the distance between human and human is getting actually larger, that you don't really get even to talk to your neighbors nowadays. So I think one of the things that we were working with these groups of communities was the voices. Who are these voices, and whose voices do we allow to be heard? Is it chosen by us? Is it chosen by the community? Does the community feel that they actually have the power to make that voice and to make their voices heard? Or is it decided and curated by the state? So those are some of the things that usually come up when we work in the community. So next slide, please. And this is a quite an interesting thing that I thought we need to include in this, is that I think Sunitha also gave quite a really good context as to how Singapore and Malaysia is, but specifically Singapore, a very highly capitalistic city-state. And then interestingly, the idea of art still is in the minds of many people, the idea of art actually still belongs very much to the bourgeoisie or the aristocrats. And if you look at this image, this is you see that it's done in June 2020. So in the middle of the pandemic, our national paper actually did a survey asking people in Singapore what are the essential jobs and the non-essential jobs in Singapore. And you can see that us artists, 71% of us, and we are at the top of the most non-essential jobs in Singapore. So there was a whole hoo-ha about it, you know, and the discussion about it. But actually, it's also got to do with the idea of the disconnection between the everyday person and how and what they envision is art. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we continue to have critical discourses over this idea? Who does art, and who has the power to do art? Who has the freedom, the free time to do the art? Next slide, thank you. So in Singapore, interestingly, the government is highly supportive of the arts. Actually, the space that I'm in now, my office, is what we call the arts housing by the government. So we rent from the government at a low price to be in this space. And I went to do some research on statistics, and I found that in 2019, the financial year 2019, the government spent 1.06 billion Sing dollars on arts, culture, and the sports. But 31% actually goes to this association called People's Association, you see at the bottom right. And 25% goes to the arts, goes to the sports, and then 8.7% goes to heritage, and 7.5% actually only goes to the National Arts Council. And if you look at these two images, maybe I'll talk quickly about them, is that the National Arts Council actually runs this, have been running this thing called Arts in Your Neighborhood. So with Arts in the Neighborhood, essentially is using stipulated spaces and getting, give me a second, as with all internet happenings. As I was saying, the stipulated spaces and in community spaces, and then demarcating them, getting the license to perform within these spaces, and getting the artists, quality artists, to bring shows for entertainment and enlivening the spaces that are available in the community. So that's essentially what Arts in the Neighborhood does. So the curatorial programming is actually done by a programming team within the National Arts Council. And the artists then creates within the themes that were being set and proposed by the National Arts Council. Okay. And the other one on the bottom right, I mentioned earlier about People's Association, very much about community participation and community building. I think Janet mentioned about it a little bit, about the ideas of how these words were being used. And the idea of the People's Association actually is that in Singapore, we have this thing called the National Day, and it's in August. So basically, it celebrates our independence from the Singapore's nation independence, and it's usually in August. So what happens is that the People's Association, the month leading up to August, will usually have this thing called the Passion Arts Week or Month. And usually, they'll get artists to design frameworks where the community is asked to participate in usually the theme of community building, communal living, but usually with national symbols and I would say national propaganda of how families should be, how life and community should be. And so when a lot of money, when I started this slide with about funding that is being pumped into it, and then but yet the artists actually, if you realize, work within certain frameworks. Next slide, please. And what happens is that after maybe about almost 10 years, we realized that there still aren't many local Singaporean groups who do their own self-ground up art projects without these kinds of support within a certain like festival that is government run. So in this photo, it's a project that we did called Both Sides Now. Some of you might have heard of it. It's essentially about living and dying well. We have been doing it since 2013 and actually still continuing it in different neighborhoods in Singapore. So this is like a typical public housing estate that you see in Singapore. About 80% of us live in public housing in Singapore, good quality. And but in the sense of how it has been done is that if you see the picture that the red flag on the left side is actually something that we used, meaning cultural identity. So it's actually the Chinese funeral blanket that usually when somebody passes in the family, and if you look through, at the background, the place where it's lit, the bottom area, we call it the void deck. So funerals sometimes happen at the void deck area, where families and friends or neighbors sometimes can come and then have sending off the last rites of the deceased. And then funeral blankets like that will usually be put up and sent by different people to comfort the family. And actually the family continues to bring these blankets home as an offering, and then they actually use it as a part of a gesture and cultural identity. So in this project where we used it, an artist, Shirley So, whom we were working with, a visual artist, she was working with the community, actually a group of senior ladies who are very good with their handicraft, to design what they imagine the funeral blankets can look like. And we actually set up all these bamboo structures, as you can see in the photo, around the estate of this living area, and talking about living and dying. So sharing with people about how what are their thoughts, and using these as stimulus for critical discourses to happen around this topic of living and dying. And then I think what's also interesting was because in Singapore there is a large group of people who will think that talking about dying in this way, when it's so in your face, is pretty taboo. So while we were setting this up, actually there were some people who were living, because this installation actually went over on the other side as well, facing this installation, and was actually pretty unhappy. So that conversation then begins, about what do we think about living and dying, the taboo of it, why is it not okay, and what is the purpose of this artwork. And then this is how then the art doesn't belong to the artist anymore. It's really about that conversations with the community and getting them involved in it, alongside with the other installations of Both Sides Now. I mean, if you're interested, you can go to bothsidesnow.com, I think. Yeah, and then you can see more information about it. And next slide. The other thing that I also wanted to talk about is spaces. So I talked about voices, I talked about the art form itself, and then I think spaces. Singapore, I went to Google, I realized that we are the third most densely populated place in the world. It's very small. It's only 728 kilometers square, about 50 kilometers from east to west, and 27 kilometers from north to south. And if you see in this photo, it's kind of like a usual typical picture that you will see, high-rise building, and all of us live in, like, some people will call it pigeonholes, little apartments, and then it will be peppered with some greenery around the area and some green spaces. But if you notice, the spaces between each unit block is actually very, very close. So as time goes around, the government also was thinking about increasing the population of Singapore very significantly. They needed more places for people to live, and the pigeonhole public apartments that we're living actually is getting smaller and smaller, and the distance between each block is getting closer and closer. And a lot of actually green spaces and open spaces have been decreasing. And recently, and it's very recent, like maybe last week, there is an accidental removal of 70 hectare woodland in an area in Singapore where they were trying to assess it for nature preservation. So the amount of open spaces for interactions, for gathering, for chance passing, chance meetings have all been decreasing in over time. And next slide. And what do we do about it when these opportunities for neighborliness, for communal gathering has disappeared? So this photo is at Dakota Crescent. It's a project that I mentioned earlier, the Ignorant of Its Lost. Essentially, these are very low-rise public housing that were built actually during the British colony time. And this particular estate is in the center of Singapore, a very prime land. And it was the last Singapore Improvement Trust, which is the public housing authority, built by the British at the point in time. And it is like a green oasis amongst that big all those high-rise public housing that you have seen. And actually what was very shocking was that in 2016, maybe I'll talk about this first. The residents staying in these apartment blocks, most of them, actually almost all of them, are from the rented community. And they have been living there for some 20, 30 years. And they are quite a lot of them are pretty old. And so they have been living there all their lives, actually. And then and paying low rental rental fee for the place that they're living in. And they actually found out from the papers, rather than being informed, that their estate is going to be torn down. Architecturally, it's going to be removed for future development. Okay, because it's prime land, it's sitting between two subway stations. And then at that point in time, we went and worked with the communities and the rented community staying there, together with the stakeholders, the NGOs who are there supporting, and the grassroots organizations who are, some of them have connections with government officials, to see what there is that we can do. How do we allow actually these residents, especially these rental residents, to be more informed, or actually be part of this entire process of being removed from where they were staying. And so the process of this project was that the earlier, about 8-9 months period, was spent on doing workshops with these communities, and then getting the stakeholders involved. And then the subsequent period, where we were moving towards a production, was inviting the outsiders, meaning people living in Singapore, who may not know this place very well, and then coming in to converse and dialogue about a larger issue about land ownership in Singapore. So I guess the idea of public space, who owns it, and actually within a small, like 5 meters from one part to the other, from public housing to the road, it could have involved a few different authorities, because actually in public spaces in Singapore, it's largely managed and owned by different government authorities. So from the Parks Board to the town councils, etc. Of course, in recent years, they have this new app that they came out with, One Municipal, where you can come out with a lot, or rather you can go to there for all your solutions, one-stop solution. Next slide, please, the last slide. Some of you might be familiar with this because we actually were very, very lucky to have ICAF support to bring it to Rotterdam in 2017. This was also in reaction or response to decreasing public spaces for open dialogues and in Singapore. So the idea was to occupy and reclaim open spaces for conversations and performances, creating an iconic but yet safe environment and space for people to talk and tackle challenging issues. We actually even did our research by going around the different open spaces in Singapore to measure so that we make sure that whatever we built will fit into the space. But as we were building it over a few years and then using it, the amount of public open spaces was decreasing. So the idea of public amenities and public spaces, those are questions that will constantly be on our minds in terms of, what does it mean, who owns it, and who are able to have a say or have that conversation about how we use spaces here in Singapore. So thank you for your patience. I pass it back to Sunitha.
Thanks very much, Ling. Yeah, I was actually trying to jump in to say we're running a little over time. But
Sorry.
I realized I couldn't as the moderator. I was silent in the back room. But thank you so much. I think it was really fascinating for a lot of the audiences also to hear in more detail the kind of work that you've been doing at Drama Box as well as Grace's projects. Janet went through very fast, so maybe people might have more questions for her now. We do have some comments that have come in, and I just want to remind people, just go ahead and put them in the chat. And the first question, so I'm just going to refer to that straight away, but also it'll be nice if you guys also have questions for each other so we can keep this a conversation and not just a one-on-one question-answer kind of situation, okay? So the first question came in quite early. So even though they didn't say who the question is for, I think maybe it might be for Janet, because it came in at the end of her presentation. They're asking why you think there's been a move from a social reform focus to issues around well-being. I'm also not 100% clear if I understand the question, because I'm not sure if they're referring to a move by artists, or it could be a move from more of a policy standpoint. But Janet, do you have any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I think the whole movement of community or socially engaged arts actually has a parallel with the student movement in Asia, and that includes the shutting down and the decrease of public voice. And I think that first generation were more political activists, people who are more who would call themselves political activists, but we have come to the second generation of artists, and their mindset is maybe a bit wider. They are more concerned with, losing our environment, although it's related to the political situation, but they have a wider view of, public health or nature, etc. So you find, although the two generations are functioning at the same time in the arts, in the socially engaged arts, there is a tendency for the younger ones to not focus so much on politics, but on issues that really concern them as a generation. So that's what I kind of noticed, even like between Chun Mei when she started and now, she's not active, but there are many younger people who follow her model, but their concern is a little bit different from, she herself. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. We also have a question, I think this is just more for clarification, where they've asked whether the Arts Council, so this would be referring to Singapore, whether they have programs for communities very much like what you see in Europe. So maybe Ling, because you've worked a lot with Arts Council support, but you also do things which are, a little bit outside of the kind of things that the Arts Council is interested in. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that relationship with the Arts Council and when it comes to communities and art support.
Yep. I apologize first that I'm not very familiar with what the European Capital of Cultures program does. So I'll talk specifically about how the relationship has been with the National Arts Council in Singapore. There are different ways in which they are supporting or rather working with the artists and the arts communities in Singapore. I think just now one of the things that I brought up was specifically Arts in the Neighborhood, which is kind of like a festival that pre-pandemic happened twice a year. Usually from about a few weeks to a month long of activities within a certain geographical location. So these are spaces that, so for example, a particular housing estate that they worked with in the Housing Development Board, which is the authority that looks after the housing area. And then there were certain areas that they marked out that is suitable or available for performances to happen. And then once they secure those spaces, and then the curators and the programmers from the National Arts Council will then run the festival in terms of getting artists to either submit proposals or invite the artists to create projects based on either specific communities that they would like to bring up. So for example, let's say the senior in that particular area in a particular NGO over there, or NGO over there, and then or VWOs, and then the artist creates the work within that frame. So the frame is set up by the National Arts Council about the themes of what that session will be, as well as the invitation of the artist, and usually they shape it with the artist, but still most of the time less process based than what most of us probably watching this live stream will be familiar with, in terms of the long process that it takes to understand, develop the relationships with communities with. It's quite a lot of the programs, I won't say all, quite a lot of the programs were still largely where, the artists probably just, have a performance, and then they perhaps do a dance, Indian dance performance at that particular stipulated location. Yeah, so it's still usually within that frame. However, increasingly, I think I have also seen last year during the pandemic, there were things like, for example, in that particular area, they tried to excavate stories from the area, and then they get the actors to and the arts groups to create stories based on the area. Yeah, I mean, I don't know how it's developing now during the pandemic, and what will happen post-pandemic, but yeah, that's what it is. Grace, do you have anything to add on about this thing?
That's a really good point, because I've actually worked in Liverpool for a bit, which is one of the European capital of culture recipients. And I think a lot of the focus was on urban regeneration, and within the whole collection of European societies, raising the platform, the visibility of this city, And so I would say that in comparison, the stakes are pretty high when you're being awarded as the status of a cultural capital, and for a period of time you're given massive resources to really try to produce a more sustainable presence of this city's spirit, this city's growth through the arts and through. So even though when I was working in Liverpool, it was ages after they were awarded that, it really turned the city over. Hull as well, so on top of like tourism, it was really museums and all that were given, cultural venues and spaces were given new leases of life that could allow them to continue to, they were enabled in a way, that spirit of there, as compared to what you were saying, that, it's not just an events-based thing where once a year we have cultural events happening, people participate, people consume, but then we'll wait till next year where the same shows, where shows come back again. So I think the maybe sometimes the intentionality is a bit different.
I think I should mention that with the Arts Council, they have their priorities very clearly outlined in their plans. And when it comes to community, the focus tends to be very much more on accessibility and making sure that people are engaging in the arts, and not so much about whether it's to do with issues of urbanization or addressing some other kind of social cause. Okay, thanks. We've got another question, which is also related to Singapore and the Arts Council, actually, where they've said that it's interesting that the National Arts Council in Singapore has a curatorial and programming role, and how is that perceived by artists, whether that can be perceived as restrictive? So this obviously to the Singaporeans.
Well, I feel like Access Pub, we're kind of like in between the Malaysian model and the Singapore model, you know, where we are not, the funding doesn't come from the Arts Council for us to operate, and we have to really scavenge for our resources. But again, like I've mentioned, that comes with the liberty to be able to really build the kind of connection that we want on the ground. Because, yeah, I mean, when it comes, if you were to take people's money, it does come with its T's and C's. and it's a social contract. So I always feel that, you know, from my perspective, I am mindful of what is expected. You know, of, in this case, the programming and curatorial kind of restrictions that come in place because the agendas are set in the arts plan. And it's not covert, you know, it's like they don't spring it on you. It's very, very clear what the expectations are outlined. So, you know, it's whether you want to sign that contract or not.
I think if I can jump in here, I just want to note that Malaysia does not have an arts council.
Exactly.
And most community arts projects, they would have to either function on their own, non-profit. So that's why it's very much led by individuals with a passion or with a commitment. And some of them do more and more nowadays. You can get actually funding from corporates who are actually using either their greening policy or their, you know, they're doing something to the environment, and they have to give back something to that particular community, like, you know, palm oil, you know, and then give back to the community or something. And so you find community groups taking money from these corporates, but they will state that their works are either educational or social. They, you know, even though they might have an underlying political agenda, but they won't state it out that they're doing, you know, that kind of activism. So they do play with the funders' language, lah, you know, basically. But not having an arts council certainly gives more freedom, lah, you know. Definitely.
Yeah, I think so too. In terms of I think what Grace outlined in terms of the T's and C's. But interestingly, also probably continuing on the trajectory that Janet was doing, the comparison between the earlier generation and the current generation, it might also be seen as a perspective of opportunities, because, you know, I don't have to worry about the producing things. I can just focus on the artwork. For Drama Box, actually we were and have been doing it on our own. So in the sense that we do have to raise other monies from other foundations, donations, to run our community-based projects in public spaces. So, but similarly, like what Jenna was talking about, you know, with foundations, etc., there are still expectations about certain kinds of things and agendas, but it might be slightly different from the national body and the national agenda. You know, so I think it's that fine line and the constant negotiation of an understanding by the practitioners of, you know, okay, does this sit with me? You know, am I okay to take it with that? Personally, I do feel that I also find it quite interesting that the Arts Council actually has a curatorial and programming role. Because I do think that actually could it have been given to, say, like producers to curate and then work with, say, an artistic director on the program itself and develop it further. You know, I think I mean, I'm interested to see that possibility of what could happen in the future if that actually happens. You know, what kind of programs that could work in the ground, and then this so-called political agenda is quite a taboo word in Singapore. but what other agendas can we have in terms of pushing social issues or allowing the marginalized and difficult topics to be tackled with care? Yeah. So actually, I'm also quite curious if Sunitha, you have been living here for a long time and doing research in all these things as well, to hear what you have to say. And also, actually, John Dean, I just saw your comments, and it's quite like I feel like quite a loss because I can see that you probably have some thoughts, but I cannot really like interact and dialogue with you on it. Yeah. So I really hope if you can tell us more about it. Yeah. But yeah, that's from me.
Okay, so yeah, I've just put up that comment that Hui Ling's referring to by John Dean about having worked in Singapore and being familiar with it. I was going to ask a question actually, which relates to some of what you're saying, but we've just got another question that's come in, so I'm going to look at that first. Okay, so we have a question from Grace saying, how do you see that community and social practice arts will change or evolve after a year of social distancing and gathering restrictions? And I think this is an interesting question, given that one of the themes that emerged across all of your presentations was to do with the commons reclaiming space, whether it's space for conversations, to make voices heard, to have more of an active citizenry. So given that we have the situation right now, do you think that your constituents will continue to engage, or maybe what kind of strategies are you employing so that you can continue to engage with them? And he also mentions that digital access poverty is a challenge.
I could jump in here. I think it's really interesting because when lockdown restrictions started to come in, the fastest to pivot were the disabled artists that I work with locally and internationally, because we rely so much on, ways that does not require us to take up public space, because mobility and sometimes could be an issue. So going online was something that we have always done. We just migrated from Skype to Zoom. Mostly that was the big migration for a lot of the artists that I work with. They were very quick to pivot. They were also and they were used to being cancelled on. They were used to being rejected. They're used to, so the mindset, it seems like they were built for social distancing and restrictions really throughout their careers. So that was an interesting perspective. And right now for us, because it's a growing movement in Singapore, and I talked about ally creation in my presentation. So it's very, very small. So far, it's not like our shows or our our engagements are attracting mountains of people. We've always been quite a small community, and which is okay. We believe in quality over quantity, and really investing in this small group of people that are training together, creating platforms together. So right now we're not at that stage yet that we would feel the sting of these restrictions.
Ling or Janet, would you like to respond to this?
I had to do two projects, community-based projects during the lockdown, and it's interesting, I guess, because the communities that we were working with, they kind of they're very into gathering. So gathering restrictions is a problem for them because they're a community, right? So they just go stop work lah, and then we will just continue after the restriction is lifted, And where social distancing is concerned, there's no social distancing actually. It's just wearing the mask. So distancers, they don't understand the meaning of social distancing. So basically, I think quite a lot of stuff can still go on. It is more like an outside, they see it as a government restriction on them. Because actually within their very small pigeonhole units, it's quite impossible not to gather as a family or with your neighbor in the narrow corridors. Urban living in Malaysia and Singapore is quite intimate very tight. And because we don't have so much of public space, or maybe even if we go to cafes, etc., that it's really a critical gathering is very important aspect for them. So I think in the future, it's just going to be learning how to use, I think it's all going to happen live. It's not going to be so much on digital, but it's just with more precautions. That's all. I mean, that's how the last couple of projects went. It's just taking on those precautions. And digitally, what I found very interesting is just the use of WhatsApp among the community. Just opened up, communication. They are more connected than anybody else. I mean, communities, among themselves, having WhatsApp communication. And it was easier to get messages. So it was actually a discovery by us about how communities are connected through digital. But this kind of like creative use of Zoom or performing via Zoom, that's not within their vocabulary as yet.
For us, interestingly, at Drawbox, we decided to, during the pandemic period, to actually slow down a lot, to regroup and reflect and start thinking again, like, okay, where do we want to go and how do we want to go about it? So actually, we kind of took quite a long, I wouldn't say break. We were constantly thinking. We still did a festival online last year, but other than that, actually, we didn't want to go full on into kind of community engagement, because like what Gray was talking about, it was very, very hard. Especially a lot of our work is in public spaces, and then it's actually even frowned upon by the people in the community together sometimes. But I realized that one thing that came up as an opportunity was that because the number of people that is allowed together has decreased. So, in Singapore, we have this term called key performance indicators. So essentially, when you get, it's a short, we like acronyms, so it's called KPI. So essentially, it's like kind of like when you take the terms and conditions lah, when you get the money, then these are the things that you need to achieve, as a impact of your work. So one of them is usually numbers, how many people came to your event. But because of the pandemic, suddenly this KPI on numbers became quite flexible, in the sense that, you can't gather people, then how, So, but I thought that actually provided an opportunity, because a lot of our work is very intimate and participatory. So actually smaller numbers in groups actually provided that platform to allow us to have deeper conversations and interactions with people in the community. Yeah, so I think that is something that at least on our end, we are thinking about, using this opportunity to start doing things that we really probably think of doing, which is smaller, more intimate, sometimes maybe even oral in terms of allowing audio to come into play. There is this group whom you will see actually tomorrow at your time, European time should be afternoon, Three Pumpkins. That group, interestingly, was that the founder of Three Pumpkins took the opportunity, and she was already working in the on the ground with some low income communities, and then a lot of them were seniors, and actually then gotten this government funding to support the communities, because in Singapore, one of the first things to cut off during the pandemic was actually social services. And a lot of the seniors suddenly lost that kind of support, be it financial, no, but more of like emotional support, yeah. And so what Three Pumpkins did was they actually took the opportunity and created radio plays and and radio MP3 tracks of stories, which are actually streamed on live at 24 hours. You can just go to the ICAF website and play it, of vernacular stories in vernacular languages, dialogue in Malay as well as creating programs by artists for children, because they're stuck at home, right, to do art and craft and different kind of artistic expression programs from home. Yeah, so I mean, if you want to, you can just take a look at the ICAF website, looking for Three Pumpkins, the two videos that you can watch, actually the two playlists, yeah, you can watch. But I think that actually provided an opportunity whereby the artists managed to get money to do what they like to do, pivot in a certain way, and yet create very meaningful impact to the communities. Yeah, so that is at least I thought it was quite a positive example of what we saw during the pandemic.
I think that's a really great example, actually. And it's also a good segue because we are reaching the end of our time here. So it's good to be talking about what the audience can follow up on tomorrow. But I think there were some really nice points that emerged from what you guys just shared, because in Singapore especially, artists are always doing. There's a lot, and Janet is also a very busy person. So there was the opportunity to slow down and reflect on what people were doing. And I think it's also very interesting that it created the opportunity to analyze people's social relationships by looking at how the communities that you work with are changing, how they interact with each other, and how artists then can work with them. I think there is a lot of reflecting that has emerged in this past year and will continue to emerge. So I'm going to wrap things up now. We actually don't have any more questions, but we do have quite a few comments. People saying it was very inspiring presentations from amazing women. It was very fascinating to learn and understand your practice and working environments and to see the similarities and differences and how to overcome them. So I want to thank all the speakers for sharing your practice with us. And I also want to thank the audience for being here to listen to us and engage with us. So thank you all very much. I just have to say a couple of things about the next event. It's called the Interactive Presentation and Participatory Video by Common Frames, and this is going to be happening in an hour and a half from now, which is 4 p.m. Rotterdam time and 11 p.m. here. But for those of you in other parts of the world, it's an hour and a half from now. Also do check out the ICAF website for the full program and see what else is happening. And do like Drama Box's Facebook, Instagram, and also if you have questions that you would like to ask as follow-up, please also reach out to them through their social media platforms, and they will direct it to the speakers. Thank you all again. Thank you very much, and have a good night.
Good night.